the mail. You may drop it off beginning September 22nd at the main office of the Board of Elections, which is at Northwest Plaza. And then beginning October 22nd, you may drop it at one of the satellite Board of Elections. The closest one to most of us will be at the Clarkson Wilson Center, which is on Clarkson Road, 82 Clarkson Road at the West County Government Center. That's starting October 22nd. That is also a location for what is called absentee in-person voting, which begins on October 22nd through November 2nd. And so that's absentee. If you are voting the mail-in ballot, again, you need to get the application for that as soon as possible. The last date is October 21st. And that ballot must be notarized and also must be mailed. It cannot be dropped off. It cannot be taken anywhere. I understand the only thing you can do is if you don't use it, if it's totally blank, you could turn it in at a poll on election day, but there'd be no point in that. If you get it, use it, but you have that option only if it is not filled out to surrender it at a polling place. And then your last option, of course, is voting in person. And this year you may vote at your assigned polling place, which may have changed this year. But you can also vote at any polling place that's open this year. Just if you know someplace where they're voting, you may walk in and vote right then and there at any place. So those are your main ways. And just be sure that you do make a plan and follow your plan. The next thing real quickly I want to tell you all is to please get involved. Imagine yourself on the morning of November 4th, or even God forbid, January 20th, and you think I could have done more. Don't put yourself in that position. Please get involved in something where you can do your part to help Democrats get elected and work for progressive causes. And all of the candidates have websites and they're looking for volunteers. There's several other wonderful causes. One of them, we have a speaker tonight with a Clean Missouri group that will tell us how to defeat Amendment 3, which would gerrymander our legislative districts again. And then there are a couple of other things to get involved in. One is the St. Louis Democratic Party is going to have no contact lit drops for non-registered voters. And I will put the information in the chat for how you can get involved in that if you're interested in registering non-registering voters in your neighborhood. There are also a couple of ways to be involved in voter protection, which I know that one of our speaker will tell you more about. There's one through the Missouri Democrats, and we'll put you watch for on our website for information about how to be either a poll worker, a poll observer, poll rover, but watch our website. Our website is chesterfielddemocrats.org. And then we have a Facebook page, which is Chesterfield Township Democrats. So one of the two places there, you can register for any of our programs at those sites, or you can sign up for these initiatives. And remember, I have something, I think I must have heard it. I don't think I came up with it on my own, but I always think, if not us, then who is going to do this important work? And if not now, when? So please get involved so that you can know that you've done your part. And finally, I want to say, if you are not a member of the Chesterfield Township Dems, again, you can do that at our website, chesterfielddemocrats.org, and there's an About Membership link. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Mike to introduce our speakers.
All right, thank you, Kathy.
Sure.
We do have two speakers tonight, and we do encourage you to submit questions. Please use the question and answer icon on the bottom of your screen. If you happen to see the raised hand function, we are not using the raised hand function. And as there's information being presented tonight that could be of use to you, you will be able to see that in the chat boxes. Kathy talked about how important this election is and the confusion and back and forth around Clean Missouri. So we're proud to have Mary Timmel She's coming back for an encore performance. She was with us 2 weeks ago. She can give us some of the latest updates and tell us again just how important this is for us in this fall's election.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be back. I've got some slides to share for you folks, but I really appreciate Kathy's call to get involved because I will also be asking you to get involved at the end. One of the things we're going to talk about a little bit about Amendment 3 and what's been happening and what's going on moving forward. All right. So first, my name is Mary Timmel, as Mike said, and I am an organizer with the No One Amendment 3 campaign. And this campaign is a coalition of organizations who are coming together to fight this politician protection plan, which is known as Amendment 3. And like many of you and many Missourians, this is a personal fight for me. I gathered signatures for Amendment 3. I organized volunteers to gather signatures. For Clean Missouri. And then I, was very proud when we won and talked about, this is what we want. We made a very clear, direct statement to politicians that we wanted districts that were fair, that were not gerrymandered, and 62% was the winning number for that. So you don't get that without a bipartisan coalition of Missourians and Missouri voters coming forward. Unfortunately, while we were doing all that work and we were getting Clean Missouri passed and stating what we wanted, there were politicians and lobbyists who were already talking about overturning the will of the voters. So from 2018, 2019, they really tried to come up with a plan to overturn Clean and to say that they didn't want non-gerrymandered districts. And they finally achieved it by getting it on the ballot for Amendment 3. So we're going to talk about why Amendment 3 is bad, why we don't want it, and what they are saying versus what Amendment 3 does. So the politicians are putting up a lot of smoke screens that they are trying to trick voters. Their claim is that Amendment 3 eliminates all lobbying gifts. The truth of that is it is a $5 change and also puts in a lot of loopholes. So it does not eliminate all lobbying gifts. And their second claim is about campaign contribution limits for state Senate candidates. That is a $100 change going from $2,500 to $2,400. So they're not actually saying how much it is. So it is a $105 change. That's it. And the rest of it is about gerrymandering and making gerrymandering legal in Missouri. So there's bad things you would expect, more partisanship, more secrecy, carved up communities, and weakened protections for voters, and some new loopholes that allow gerrymandering. And these are in the fine print, and they are trying to mislead voters by only talking about those other things. There's also 3 brand new bad things in Amendment 3, which is why we want to vote no, because these are the details that they're hiding behind this misleading language. It's going to put lobbyists and political operatives back in charge of drawing the maps. It's going to allow them to insert partnership and partisanship and secrecy, and it's going to carve up those communities. And one of the most radical things about it is it's also not going to count everyone in the maps when they do the redistricting. And this is one of the most radical and extreme parts. It's changing who counts. Amendment 3 is trying to change who counts. So right now, every state in the U.S., including Missouri, is counting everyone when they draw their maps for redistricting. Missouri has been counting everyone since at least 1875. What Amendment 3 is going to try to do is only count people who are eligible to vote. And so we'll talk about why does this matter, who's not going to count, and how is this discriminatory. And the explicit goal of Amendment 3 is to undo voter-approved redistricting reforms and to replace them with a brand new redistricting system unlike anything Missouri's ever seen. So it is not just a return to the redistricting rules we had in 2011 or even 2001. Amendment 3 is intentionally using confusing language to change the population base for maps. And the sponsors of Amendment 3 are explicit about that intent. They want to only count the people that are eligible to vote. And what this looks like in the numbers is that it's going to leave out over 1.5 million Missourians, the majority of whom are children, and then some are immigrants as well. So they're looking at the over 6 million population base of Missouri. About a little over 4.5 million are eligible voters, And they're cutting out more than 1.5 million Missourians. That's what they're attempting to do. And the use of the citizen voting age population is that they are trying to consolidate power. And they have been explicit about this. This plan has been in the works, and national groups have been trying to make these changes. And they're using Missouri as a test case. So they are trying to figure out, how do we consolidate power among incumbents and politicians? And how do we consolidate power and entrench it with white voters? And the impact of this policy, the impact is massive across the state of Missouri. Thomas Hofeller was a national gerrymandering mastermind, and he put this in what are now public research memos, was very clear about what they were trying to do when they make decisions like this about redistricting. So what that looks like in the numbers, what that impact is in Missouri, is that it's going to leave 1 in 5 Missourians won't be counted when they do these maps. And that's majority kids and some non-citizens. 1 in 4 Black Missourians will not be counted under this plan. 1 in every 2 Latinx Missourians will not be counted. And 1 in every 2 Asian American Missourians will not be counted. And the majority of that is because they are kids. Families with children are set to lose the most in this process. That's what the visual looks like. And I always find it really striking. You are literally wiping people off when they are making this decision. And this is going to limit the political power of the fastest growing demographic groups in Missouri. And this is, cutting people out just because they're under 18 and they're kids. But what this doesn't say as well is some of those kids could be 14, 15, 16 years old. They're not going to be counted, but they're sure going to be eligible to vote in these maps. And so if these maps don't count everyone, representation in the state legislature is going to be profoundly impacted. And communities with kids are set to lose the most under this. When communities lose representation, it leads to a loss in funding. We have a couple of quotes here by professors across the state, but Professor David Kimball at the University of Missouri explicitly stated it when he looked at it. If maps don't count everyone, representation in that state legislature is going to lead to a decline in state funding for affected communities and municipalities. Even the official fiscal note for Amendment 3 highlights this. State government entities expect no cost or savings, and individual local governmental entities expect significant decreased revenues of a total unknown amount. And so, if you're looking at a segment of the population that you're not counting, they're still using resources, but you're also starting to think about revenue. When companies look at a state that is trying to make radical and dramatic changes to this, unlike any map that's ever been done, these extreme changes, they're going to hesitate in investing in a community that's going backward. We've seen other states suffer economically for making decisions that are setting that state backward politically. And so, or not politically, but just in general, right? They're moving backward. This has led to these radical details, plus our voter mandate. That's 62% in 2018 who said they wanted fair maps. This has led to a bipartisan coalition saying no on Amendment 3. The Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilskin from President and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation has talked about how Amendment 3 is going to weaken the power of Black and Brown communities in our state. It's also folks like former GOP U.S. Senator Jack Danforth. So this is, again, across the board. And, former Senator Danforth had talked about how if you are overturning voter-approved redistricting reforms before they've even had a chance to take effect. So Amendment 3, it's not even about letting what we, it's literally undoing what we voted for before we've even seen how that's going to play out. And so this is the part where I'm so glad Kathy got to it as well, where we talk about we need your help. We need your help to defeat Amendment 3. We have all the social media channels that you know and love, where you can share graphics, you can share information, you can talk about this work there. But what we also need is volunteers and donations. You build power by organizing people and organizing money. And so if you want to donate, cleanmissouri.org/donate, and we can throw these in the chat as well. And then if you want to volunteer, we're hosting phone banks multiple times a week. We have excellent volunteers who have been showing up, making calls, and really contacting voters and having a good experience, connecting with people to talk about what matters to them and why this is going to be harmful for Missouri is something that we need. This election is getting closer by the day. So if you want to volunteer and give some time, Kathy hit it hard, but I will too. Volunteering and realizing that you can make a difference by giving your time is so important. And we appreciate all of our volunteers. So we want to welcome you into that group. So you can find that at cleanmissouri.org/volunteer. If you are part of an organization that has not yet endorsed Clean Missouri, you can do that as well. And there's a nice overview at cleanmissouri.org. So I want to thank the Chesterfield Dems and all of you for having me again. I really enjoy making sure voters are educated. So if you're part of a group that hasn't had us come and speak, please reach out. And thank you so much. I'll see if there's any questions and I can chat before I take off. Okay, let's see. All right. Thank you all so much.
Okay. And as you said, if you have other questions, please use the question and answer tab, and we will get to those after our next speaker. As we've heard, we just went through a very important and critical issue, and it's one that we all need to be aware of. Our next speaker is Denise Lieberman. She's talking about voting against a pandemic. She is a civil rights lawyer who also coordinates the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocates. As a nationally recognized voting rights expert, Denise has testified on voting rights before Congress and most recently served as Director of Power and Democracy for the Advancement Project National Office in Washington, D.C. Denise is also a faculty director of the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative at Washington University in St. Louis, where she is an adjunct professor. Denise has been at the forefront of voting rights debates in her home state of Missouri and across the country. She is currently lawyer of record in a pending lawsuit challenging in-person notary requirements for absentee ballots and mail-in ballots in Missouri. And with that, I will turn it over to Denise.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to Chesterfield Township for inviting me to speak tonight. It suddenly got very dark in this room. This room usually has a lot of light, and now it's very dark, so I apologize about that. But I'm going to be sharing some slides, so hopefully you won't have to look at my face in the dark for much longer. I want to thank you for including me here today. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocates that work to protect the right to vote in Missouri. And it includes approximately 50 organizations statewide who collaborate to identify barriers and fight them to the right to vote and advocate for voting reforms that ensure all people are able to cast a ballot. So I'm going to share my screen here. So the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition has actually been meeting since 2006. So we've been doing this for about 14 years. In a variety of capacities. We achieve our mission through 4 categories of work, and that includes engaging in policy advocacy. So we have a presence in the state capitol in Jefferson City. We track and provide analysis, talking points, testimony on voting-related legislation. We also engage in advocacy with election officials. So we meet with the Secretary of State's office. We also reach out to local election authorities across the state of Missouri. We also engage in legal advocacy and litigation. As Mike mentioned, we are currently in court challenging in-person notary requirements for mail-in absentee ballots. In fact, we just spent the last several weeks getting all of our trial testimony done via Zoom remotely. It's been an interesting process. Just submitted our trial brief late last night and have arguments before the court this week. The third bucket of work that we undertake is voter engagement and education. So we produce palm cards and informational materials, toolkits, and other trusted educational materials for voters. And finally, our signature program is election protection. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition coordinates nonpartisan election protection efforts in the state of Missouri, which includes the 866-R-VOTE hotline, as well as poll monitors. And this year we are also including social media monitors to address issues of misinformation. So I'd like to start tonight by echoing the comments Kathy made earlier about having a plan. And we're going to focus on that quite a bit tonight. But first and foremost, the thing that you need to do is ensure that you're registered to vote, and ensure that your friends, your constituents, your neighbors, the members of your church are registered to vote as well. And if you have moved since the last time you voted, you're going to need to update that registration. Same if you've changed your name since the last time you voted. The good news is that you can do this entirely online in Missouri now at sos.mo.gov/elections, where you'll have an opportunity. You'll see a screen that looks a little like this one that can allow you to either print out a voter registration application, print it out at home and mail it in, or you can complete it entirely online, as long as you have a smartphone or a tablet that will allow you to sign with your finger or a stylus. Keep in mind that the deadline to register to vote is October 7th, and this deadline is going to hold true for any updates to your registration. So if you have moved, make sure that you are registered to vote at your current address. And if you need a good excuse to promote voter registration in your organization or to your friends and neighbors, keep in mind next Tuesday, September 22nd, is National Voter Registration Day. And we're going to have events going on all across the state of Missouri. It's a great day to really plan to do something to encourage people around you to check their registration and make sure their registration is up to date. If you have any questions about the status of your registration, you can always call our election protection hotline at 866-R-VOTE. That's 866-687-8683. We have attorneys who answer these calls. They're able to assist you in real time. You can call now. It's not just something that's live on election day. You can call and ask any questions that you have about your registration or how you can cast a ballot, or to report any challenges, issues, concerns that you may have. So I want to echo what was how we started this evening with make a plan. We know that issues of voting are on everybody's mind right now, and concerns about voting are exacerbated amid this pandemic, amid challenges to the United States Postal Service. Everything is up in the air. There's new laws on the books that are confusing to understand. And so it's really important to make a plan. What we say is don't panic, vote early. Don't panic, make a plan. Listen, we have been able to ensure that democracy functions in this country through a range of challenges throughout our nation's history. We managed to ensure people could cast a ballot during the Civil War. We managed to ensure people could vote during the 1918 flu pandemic. And we will ensure that all people can vote in November of 2020, a very consequential election. And so there's just a few questions that you really want to ask and answer for yourself. How do you want to vote? How are you going to be able to vote this year? Do you feel like you need to vote by mail? For many people, the prospect of going to a polling place on election day is fraught with concern because of the pandemic. A polling place is really the very definition of everything the CDC recommends against. It's enclosed, indoors, crowds, lots of different people touching similar things. And so even with security precautions in place, which our election jurisdictions are doing their best to comply with, it is a fraught situation for many. And so many people want to know if they can vote by mail. But keep in mind, and there's two ways to do that. We're going to talk about both of those ways. If you qualify, you can vote absentee, which is easier. if you don't meet one of the reasons to vote absentee, under a new law, any voter in Missouri can vote by mail this year, but it's much harder to apply for, and all those ballots must be notarized and can only be returned by United States mail. So you want to make sure to check and see if perhaps you might qualify to vote absentee, because it's going to be an easier process. Keep in mind, you can also vote absentee in person if you qualify to vote absentee. That's another option for people that want to skip the crowds at the polls on election day, but are concerned about engaging in an interaction over the mail. And of course, there's always the option of voting on election day, but please make sure that you've checked and confirmed your polling place, because in many jurisdictions, polling places have changed. And in St. Louis County, for example, they cut the number of polling places in about half compared to prior elections for a variety of reasons, including just many that are really not good fits to serve as polling places amid the pandemic, shortage of poll workers that are readily available to staff these locations, and the anticipated increase in people voting by mail, either absentee or no excuse mail-in ballots. So let's talk about how we can do this, voting by mail. First, I want to point you to our recent palm card that has been released. I'll be sure to share this with our organizers tonight. And this really goes through a step-by-step process of how you can figure out how you can submit a ballot by mail in Missouri in 2020. And it's a little confusing because there is a new law that was passed in acknowledgement of the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. That it includes a new reason to vote absentee for people that fall into an at-risk category for COVID-19, allowing them to vote absentee without a notary, and a new provision allowing any other voter who does not qualify to vote absentee to cast a ballot by mail without presenting any excuse at all. But like I mentioned, the rules for those two are slightly different. So let's go through it. The first question that you want to ask is, if you want to vote by mail, is what kind of mail ballot is right for me? And so if you're able to qualify for one of the reasons to vote absentee, we definitely recommend that because it's going to be an easier process. But you do have to meet one of these 7 reasons to vote absentee, 2 of which do not require a notary. And so the 2 health-related reasons you can vote absentee without a notary include reason number 2, that you expect to be confined due to illness or disability, or if you are serving as a caretaker for someone who is. So for example, I qualify to vote absentee under this provision, not because I am confined due to illness or disability, but my 89-year-old mother is, and I serve as her caretaker. In addition, as I mentioned, the legislature passed a new law allowing people to vote absentee without a notary if they have or they fall into an at-risk category for contracting or spreading COVID-19. And that's going to include people that fall into one of these 8 reasons. This is going to include, again, you can vote absentee without a notary if you have or are in an at-risk category for COVID-19, which includes any voter over the age of 65. And it also includes any voter in a long-term care facility, regardless of age, any voter with chronic lung disease who has moderate to severe asthma, regardless of their age, any voter with a serious heart condition, regardless of age, any voter who's immunocompromised, any voter who has diabetes, any voter with liver disease, any voter with chronic kidney disease who is on dialysis. All of these voters would qualify under that reason number 7 that's highlighted on this screen to vote absentee without a notary. But you can also vote absentee if you expect that you might be away from the jurisdiction So I'm someone that, at least until recently, traveled quite a bit for work. And that was frequently a reason I had to vote absentee. And even if I wasn't 100% sure I'd have to travel for work, if you expect that you could be away from the jurisdiction, that's enough to allow you to vote absentee. If you have a religious belief that prevents you from going to the polls, if you're working as a poll worker, if you're incarcerated but retain the right to vote, if you're an address confidentiality program, like a domestic violence victim or in witness protection, any of those can vote absentee. If you don't meet one of those reasons to vote absentee, any voter in Missouri can still vote by mail in 2020. But keep in mind, all those no excuse mail-in ballots must be notarized, and they can only be returned by United States mail. So as you're thinking about which of these mail-in ballots is right for me, do I qualify for an excuse-based absentee ballot, or do I take the no excuse-based mail-in ballot? It might be helpful to know some of the differences between the two, and there are some. There's differences both in how you can request that ballot and how it must be returned. So for absentee ballots, which again require an excuse, you can apply for that ballot by email or fax, in addition to sending that over the mail or doing it in person. And it can be done by yourself or by a close relative within 2 degrees of consanguinity, basically within your immediate family or up to first cousins or aunts and uncles. In contrast, the no excuse mail-in ballot, you can apply for that by mail or in person, but you can't apply for it by email like you can with the absentee ballots. Similarly, there's some differences in how you return those ballots once they come to you and you've cast your ballot. That ballot, if it's an absentee ballot, which again requires an excuse, you can return it by United States mail, but you can also drop it off in person. That is not the case with the no excuse mail-in ballots. They can be returned only by United States mail. This has resulted in some pretty strange circumstances. For example, because the election board can notarize those ballots for you, but they can't accept them. You can't turn them in person. So we have had stories of people who've gone to the Board of Elections, the St. Louis County Board of Elections, to have their mail ballot notarized, and then they were not allowed to leave them there. The voter then had to leave with that ballot and put it in a mailbox. All mail-in ballots must be notarized, and some absentee ballots must be notarized. And again, remember that the 2 health-related reasons to vote absentee do not require a notary. I'll also share that we are currently in court. I am counsel of record on a lawsuit that we brought on behalf of the NAACP and League of Women Voters, challenging the notary requirements for absentee and mail ballots. So that could potentially change. Okay, so now you have went through this process and determined if you're going to vote by mail, which type of ballot is it going to be? An absentee ballot that has an excuse, or the no excuse mail-in ballot? The other thing you should know is that you are going to need to indicate that on your application. And in many jurisdictions, the application includes both the option to vote absentee as well as the option to vote by mail. Don't check them both. You only want to check one, because again, remember, those rules are slightly different. So if you qualify to vote absentee, check one of those reasons on the screen there to vote absentee. If you do not, only then would you check that you're going to get a mail-in ballot. Now that's for people that want to undertake the entire voting process by mail. But you should know that there are other options as well if you want to avoid a crowded polling place on election day. In particular, if you qualify to vote absentee, you can also do it in person. That begins on September 22nd. which also happens to be the same day as National Voter Registration Day. So it's going to be a really great day for voting in Missouri and a great day to promote voting options in Missouri. If you qualify under one of those reasons, you can go to your local election authority office or a satellite location if they have one. St. Louis County does have several satellite locations. And you can complete this application right then and there on the spot and get your ballot and vote. You fill out the application, get the ballot, vote, all in one fell swoop. It's a process that's going to feel very similar to voting at your polling place if you were voting with the paper ballot, only you're going to be doing it at your election board headquarters. Absentee voting starts on September 22nd and goes all the way until 5 p.m. the day before Election Day on November 2nd, including that Saturday before Election Day. Nobody will have to get a ballot notarized if they vote absentee in person, because you're going to be presenting an identification to a credentialed election worker when you go vote absentee in person. So no notary requirements for those in-person absentee ballots. The other thing I'll say is, I've had these questions before. Again, the health-related reasons do not require you to get a notary if you choose to submit your ballots by mail. I've had a lot of questions from folks asking whether you need to provide additional documentation or information about your health condition, and the answer is no. You do need to check one of these boxes. You need to check if you believe that you expect to be confined due to illness or disability or serving as a caretaker. You check that box, but you don't need to provide additional notes on what that illness or disability is, or in my case, that I'm caring for my mother. Similarly, if you fall into an at-risk category for COVID-19, you don't need to indicate which of those categories you fall into, what the nature of your condition is, nor do you need to provide any sort of medical documentation. Okay. So the hardest part has been done. You've figured out, are you going to vote by mail? And if so, which ballot is right for you? Well, now the next step is that you have to apply. And as we mentioned earlier, there are slightly different rules on how to do that. But in many jurisdictions, the form includes both the opportunity to apply for either absentee or mail-in. Some jurisdictions have a separate form for absentee and mail-in, but it's still the same information. So you want to make sure that if you're voting absentee, that you mark the reason. If you don't mark the reason, they're not going to be able to send you a ballot. For the mail-in ballots, you don't need to indicate a reason. But in both cases, you need to sign that application. This is important. A number of jurisdictions do a signature match on your application once that application comes to the election board. By the way, they also do a very thorough check of all absentee and mail ballot applications. They match the information on your application to your voter registration record to ensure that, in fact, you're eligible to vote and you're eligible at the address that you've stated. Yet again, another reason to make sure that address is up to date. Regardless of whether you're requesting an absentee or mail-in ballot, it goes to the same place. You want to send this to your local election authority, not to the Secretary of State's office. For most of you, that's going to be St. Louis County Board of Elections. They have applications up on their website. You can submit, if it's an absentee ballot, you can submit that application by email. You can also use the movote.org app that will automatically help you send that application by email. If it's a mail-in ballot, you're going to have to send that in by mail or give it in person. Finally, keep in mind that there is a deadline. Any application to get a ballot by mail must be received by your local election authority by 5 p.m. on October 21st. Received, not postmarked. But we strongly encourage you to send it well ahead of time, because many of those ballots are going to still need to be notarized once you get them in return. And we know that there have been delays in the mail. So now you've applied, you did everything right, you got that ballot back in the mail, and you've cast your ballot. What next? Well, now you need to make a plan to get that ballot back into your local election authority. You need to cast your ballot in secret. If somebody assists you, which you have a right to assistance, they're going to need to sign the ballot envelope as well. You are going to need to complete everything on that ballot envelope. It includes a form where you're attesting under penalty of perjury to your identity and your eligibility to vote. In cases where a notary is required, with all mail-in ballots and some absentee ballots, you're going to have to sign that envelope in the presence of a notary. This cannot be done online. It cannot be done remotely, unfortunately, because that notary seal has to appear on the ballot envelope. That's one of the reasons we're in court challenging the notary requirement right now. Make sure your ballot envelope is signed and that you have confirmed your address. Those are two of the biggest reasons that absentee and mail ballots were rejected in the August elections. We did a public records request to all 116 election jurisdictions in Missouri to get that data, to confirm what was really happening with these ballots. And incomplete forms on those ballot envelopes were a major reason that otherwise valid votes were not counted in August. So make sure you've completed it, make sure you've signed it, and where applicable, make sure you've signed it in front of a notary. And then you're going to have to get it back. Where? To your local election office. For most of you, that'll be St. Louis County Board of Elections. You cannot drop off an absentee or mail-in ballot at your polling place. It has to be sent back to the Board of Elections. And again, those absentee ballots can be dropped off in person, but those mail ballots cannot. And the deadline is a very strict deadline. They have to have those in hand by the close of polls on election day. So, and I'm almost done here. What happens if you run out of time? What happens if you have delays? Well, we know this is a very real issue. We had just scores and scores of complaints about this into the Election Protection Hotline in August. Many people who requested absentee ballots, even very early, didn't get them until late in the game because of mail delays. And for people that then had to get those returned by United States mail and get them notarized on top of it, it really proved to be precarious, and voters couldn't confirm with certainty that if they put those ballots in the mail too close to Election Day, that they'd actually arrive in time. In fact, the United States Postal Service even sent a letter to Missouri's Secretary of State, Jay Ashcroft, expressing concerns about these deadlines and saying that valid votes might arrive after the deadline. And under Missouri law, those votes cannot be counted. So what happens if you've applied for an absentee ballot and you never got it? In that case, you can go vote at your polling place on Election Day. Now, they're going to have you on a list that says you applied for an absentee ballot, and you're going to need to tell them you never got it. And they're going to make you fill out a form called a lost ballot affidavit, where you attest, I never got it. That's going to then cancel your absentee or mail ballot request. You're going to then get a regular ballot, vote at the polls, just like you would on any other day. Now, what if you applied for and you got your ballot? Maybe you even filled it out, but you ran out of time to get it back in the mail, and you're concerned that if you tried to, it would not arrive before Election Day. Here's something you can do. You can take that ballot with you to the polling place, and you're not going to be able to turn it in there, but you can surrender it. You can cancel your absentee or mail ballot. If you go to the polls on Election Day, if you have it with you, regardless of if you filled it out or not, you can cancel that ballot at the polls on Election Day, sign the statement, and you will get a regular ballot as if you had not originally applied for a mail or absentee ballot. One election official put it this way: think of your vote as a parking spot. Once a vote is parked in your parking spot, no other votes can come in there. And so that's why poll workers have a list of everybody whose absentee or mail-in ballots have been arrived by Election Day. You're not going to be allowed to vote at the polls if your ballot has been received by the election board. But if it hasn't, and if you still have it in hand, you can surrender it at the polls on Election Day and cast a regular ballot. So I want to stop there and just do a final plug to urge people to call the Election Protection Hotline if you have any questions about your registration or about your eligibility to vote by mail or absentee. We also have the hotline in other languages. So there is a Spanish language hotline, an Asian languages hotline, and an Arabic language hotline. You can also get further information at 866ourvote.org. And finally, I want to encourage people to join our effort to protect the vote at the polls on Election Day, either by being a legal volunteer to help respond to people who call the 866-OUR-VOTE hotline, by working as a field volunteer monitoring polling places. This is going to be entirely contactless this year. We also need assistance from folks who want to help identify and rebut misinformation out there by serving as a social media monitor. And you can sign up to join the election protection effort at protectthevote.net. Finally, if you want to get more information from the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, including links to our palm cards, toolkits, links to upcoming trainings and webinars, you can just text MOVPC to 66866 and you'll be added to the list. And with that, I will stop my screen share. I've been going for quite a long time, and I'll be happy to take any questions that people may have.
All right, thank you very much. Going through, we got a lot of questions that came in through the chat as well as the Q&A. We really wish, if you do have more questions, please use the Q&A icon, not the chat icon. I'm going to have to be bouncing back and forth here a little bit. One was for contact information from our first speaker. If you're in the chat box, it's one of the very first things in the chat box. But after tonight's presentation, we will be posting contact information and other key links on our Facebook page for those of you who are looking for it. So please, our Facebook page is a great resource, and we encourage you to like us, follow us, and keep up to date with what's going on. The question, and this is actually from me personally. Last spring, when COVID was a big thing, I got an envelope and I could sign and request absentee ballots for all the upcoming elections. Did that include the November election, or was that only for elections up through this last primary?
Well, it depends on what you applied for. So
everyone, I sent them all back.
Well, you have to apply specifically for each election. So if you did apply for an absentee ballot for November, then you applied for an absentee ballot for November. But if you did not apply specifically for an absentee ballot for November, then you'll need to do so. So again, each election is its own separate request because each election, your circumstances may be different. Now, it's certainly possible to request absentee ballots for multiple elections at one time. St. Louis County sent forms for all 2020 elections to people back earlier this year that did give people the ability to request absentee ballots for the June elections, the August elections, and the November elections. But you only will get a ballot if you, in fact, requested one for each specific election. So one way you can check is by calling. You can call your local election board. The St. Louis County Board of Elections has a designated line for absentee ballot questions, and you can call and check and confirm whether or not your application is there. Keep in mind, you can apply for an absentee ballot at any time, but the election authority can't start sending them out until the absentee voting period begins. So even if you applied for an absentee ballot for November, way back when, you might be thinking, well, why don't I have that ballot yet? That's because absentee voting doesn't start until September 22nd. So even if you submitted that application a long time ago, They're legally not allowed to start sending it to you until September 22nd. So I'd recommend calling to make sure that that application is there. And if it's not, go ahead and submit another one.
You talked about signature matching. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that? What's going to happen with that? And is that a potential, as somebody call it, our version of the Florida hanging Chad problem for this election?
Yeah, a lot of people have questions about that. Signature matching is not required in the state of Missouri. What is required is that the local election authority does have to confirm your eligibility. So this is one of the reasons why mail-in voting is very safe, because you're not automatically getting a ballot in the mail. They're going to vet your application and confirm that in fact you are who you say you are, that in fact you're registered to vote at the address you say you are. Now you have to sign that absentee ballot application. What happens is any person that applies for an absentee ballot, they enter it into the statewide voter registration database. And when they enter information about you, guess what? Your whole file comes up. And that's going to include everything that you've ever done in voting in Missouri. Not how you voted, but whether you voted. So it's going to include everything down to your original voter registration application. It's going to include a lot of things that do have a signature. If you've registered to vote, if you've ever cast a provisional ballot, if you ever did a name change affidavit. And some jurisdictions, as they're checking to make sure your address, they, by the way, also have access to the last 4 digits of your social security number, your driver's license number. There's a number of different data points they can look at to confirm that your application is actually from you and that you're valid. A signature can be among them. Some jurisdictions check and see if that signature looks like it matches, and others don't. There's not a formal process in Missouri, nor is there formal training on that.
I have a question about the local media. Are you aware of any programming or public service programming that the local stations might be doing around the election, whether it is on the various ballot initiatives like, number 3, or going over the things that you talked about with the balloting on each of the days, reminding people coming up to it? Are you aware of any coordination with the local media to get this out, and are they going to participate?
I mean, I've seen quite a bit more election-related information on the local news this year than I have in previous years. That the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, we do always send out a media advisory. This year, we're also doing a whole series of public service announcements, and we've been doing quite a bit of media work. I'm certainly hopeful that that the local media will continue to provide access to accurate information. I think it's especially important this year because there's just a lot. It's so noisy out there. There's a lot of chatter, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. And it's really important that people have access to trusted information because, every state does things a little bit differently. And so be careful before you repost something on social media if you're not familiar with the source, or maybe it's come from a friend of yours in another state. Just because they do things one way in another place doesn't mean that it's going to work here.
This one, I believe, will come down to the dates, and so we can just maybe go over the dates here again. The question is, I want to vote early in person under one of the 7 reasons. Can I request and complete it at the same time at the Bureau of Elections or one of the satellite offices?
Yeah, if you want to vote absentee in person, all you have to do is show up at your election board office. And St. Louis County has satellite offices as well. They're listed on their website. And you'll complete the application and get your ballot all at the same time. And so it's going to be an experience. It's going to feel very much like if you were going to a polling place on election day. So you'll have to fill out the form saying what your reason is for voting absentee. You'll present a form of ID. They're going to then, again, check your registration record to confirm the precinct and township that you're registered in and give you the correct ballot style based on your registration record. And you'll just vote right then and there.
Is there a difference when the state or the local election authorities start to count the ballots, whether they're done via the mail or if you do in-person absentee early voting?
That's a great question. They can start. So when those ballots start coming back in, there is a time frame in which they can start processing them. But the election authorities can look and make sure that those ballot envelopes are complete anytime they start coming in. And some jurisdictions make an effort to call or reach out to people whose ballots have some sort of deficiency or error. We saw a lot of this in St. Louis County in the August elections. A missing signature, for example, was one of the most significant reasons that an absentee or mail-in ballot got rejected, because the voter just forgot to sign it, or the voter forgot to check a checkbox confirming their address. And if the election board can reach those voters in enough time, the voters can come down and cure those deficiencies. But it's just another reason to really make sure, just put double check, put eyes on that ballot envelope. Once they determine that, they do have to wait until that Friday before Election Day before they start going through and figuring out which of the ballot envelopes are complete enough to be counted. And then they cannot start the counting process until Election Day. And that counting is done under law by bipartisan teams and is allowed to be witnessed by challengers from the two major political parties.
When you say counted on Election Day, can they start before the polls close, or do they have to wait till the polls close?
They can start the tabulation process. Yeah. And so what happens is what they can start a few days before Election Day is that process of saying, yeah, this one is complete and should be counted, and no, this one's not complete, should not be counted, or this one doesn't belong to a valid voter. And that then they can all then get scanned in. The counting process then they'll scan in those ballots, and then separately, a separate tabulation occurs. And so you can think of the counting of those ballots to be sort of similar to the way they would count if you cast a paper ballot at the polling place.
This may be one. Do you know if hypertension is a valid medical reason?
That's a really great question. No. And that's another reason we went to court. The law says that you qualify to vote absentee without a notary if you fall into one of these 8 at-risk categories for COVID-19. But those were the primary at-risk categories that the CDC had back then. It doesn't include everybody who's at risk, and people with hypertension are significantly at risk, as are people who are obese, as are people who are smokers, as are people who are pregnant, and none of those are listed on the at-risk category. And you know what else it doesn't include? Maybe you don't fall into that at-risk category, but maybe you live with somebody who does, and you're have valid concerns about going out and voting in person or getting a notary and exposing that person. So that's the reason that we went to court to challenge this notary requirement, because if the legislature recognizes that people need an option to avoid going in person to a polling place during a pandemic because it's not safe, they need an option to avoid having to go to a notary in person during the pandemic because it's not safe.
Point of clarification, if you turn 65 after November 3rd, but you do turn 65 this calendar year, can you use the over 65 option?
I mean, you're not 65, so.
So you have to be 65 on or before November 3rd.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, any of you that have followed the legislature closely knows that legislation is not always drafted as perfectly and with as much explanation as we might like. So it doesn't explain that. But what I'll say is this, with respect to other age requirements, like you have to be 18 to vote, right? you can register to vote in Missouri if you're 17 and a half, as long as you will be 18 on election day. So it's the date of election day that's really like the important qualifier. So are you going to be 65 on election day? That would really be where what I would ask.
Do medical staff, doctors, assistants, and medical offices qualify for excuse number 7 if they are engaged in patient care?
Unfortunately, our essential workers who are providing this incredible medical care, who are exposing themselves to COVID-19 every day, unless they fall into an at-risk category themselves, technically don't qualify under that provision. So they might qualify under another reason to vote absentee. And again, any reason to vote absentee is still going to provide an easier way to go. But unfortunately, no, the way the law is written really excludes, we're very grateful and gratified that the legislature saw fit to include provisions for people to vote absentee without a notary who are at risk for COVID. It really is under inclusive in the range of people that are taking some risks, including people that fall into some of these other categories like hypertension or obesity that are not listed, people who don't fall into an at-risk category themselves, but live with people who do, or folks like our first responders and our medical personnel who maybe aren't in an at-risk category themselves, but are exposed to people in these at-risk categories every day and risk exposing their patients if they go and vote in person. Or have to go in person to get a no excuse mail-in ballot notarized. And again, that's precisely the reason we went to court, because we think those people should not have to put themselves and the people that they interact with every day at further risk.
A couple of questions here about the dropping off of absentee ballots. If you could just recap that again. Which ones can be dropped off? And if you need to drop them off on behalf of somebody, who is qualified to drop them off on their behalf?
That's a great question, and it really is. It is confusing. Absentee ballots can be sent by mail or dropped off in person by yourself, by the voter, or by a close relative. And if you are the close relative and you're dropping it off for someone, so, like I said, I'm a caretaker for my 89-year-old mother. She's actually on the permanent absentee list. So we always send her ballot in by mail. But let's say we were getting close to the deadline and I was worried about, or she was worried about mail delays and that ballot getting in there in time. As her daughter, I'm within 2 degrees of consanguinity. I could go drop her ballot off for her. But when I do that, and she's registered in St. Louis County, just like many of you. So I would go to the St. Louis County Election Board headquarters or to a satellite office with her ballot. I assist her in casting that ballot, so I have to sign it as well. Because she's confined due to illness, she doesn't require a notary, but she still has to sign it. If I am dropping her ballot off for her, I will have to show identification and sign that I am submitting a ballot on behalf of my mother. And I'm going to have to state what the nature of that relationship is. Because again, only close relatives can return a ballot for another voter. And so we get heartbreaking stories at the Election Protection Hotline every election, but especially this year in August, for people that were trying to help, an elderly neighbor who maybe didn't have anyone around to help them. Who waited till it was too late or was worried about mail delays. And unfortunately, under the law, you cannot return a ballot for a neighbor, for someone in your church, for a coworker, only a close relative. And you will be asked to show a form of ID if you're returning a ballot for somebody else. And you're going to have to sign an affidavit yourself and say what the nature of your relationship is to that person.
Just a little bit of a clarification and follow-up. This person had said they heard it had to be a first-degree relative. You said something about second degree. What is a second degree?
That's a great question. It's within 2 degrees of consanguinity, which means in essence, so first degree would be like parents, siblings, children. Second degree would be one level beyond that. So that could include your first cousin or like your aunt or uncle. But basically that's as far as the circle can go. So parents, children, siblings, first cousins, aunts and uncles. Grandparents, I guess, too, would fall within that. Or grandchildren. You could return it for your grandmother.
Okay. A question about ballots that are deemed invalid. Are they destroyed, or how long are they kept as a matter of record if there's a subsequent challenge?
That's a great question. I really had to get up to speed on all these procedures for our case. So they actually do keep them. When a ballot is rejected, the reason that the ballot is rejected is noted on the ballot envelope. This is a legal requirement under statute. And they have to be kept. Those ballot envelopes do have to be kept and secured in a secure place until the final certification of the votes is maintained. And that's for safekeeping in case there are any post-election day legal challenges and things of that nature. So they are kept until the final certification of the vote.
Another point of clarification, you mentioned that the number of polling places was going to be smaller this year, about half.
Yeah.
But with that, we are allowed to vote at any of the voting locations for our area?
In St. Louis County, yes, but not anywhere, not necessarily anywhere else. So this is only something that's special for St. Louis County, and here's why. So Missouri requires that you have to vote at the polling place that serves your address. And the reason for that is because you're only entitled to vote on measures that affect your precinct and your address. And so for most people, that means that's why when you show up at your neighborhood polling place, they're going to have a stack of ballots that are appropriate for people who live there. They're not going to have ballots that are appropriate to someone who can vote in a different precinct. Well, St. Louis County has new voting machines. And those voting machines, when they check you in, print an individual precinct-specific ballot for each voter. And so each voter gets a ballot that has all of the races or measures that they're entitled to vote on with this individually printed out ballot situation. And so that's why they are able to offer precinct-specific voting regardless of where you are. That's not going to be the case if you live in St. Louis City. That's not going to be the case if you are in St. Charles County, Jefferson County, or somewhere else. But it is the case in St. Louis County because of these new voting machines.
Somebody just sent in a comment that to them, the Board of Elections has been very responsive to emailed questions. So we'll just share that information with the people here tonight for their benefit. We've hit most of the specific ones for questions about this upcoming election. Somebody did ask one, and this may or may not be within your purview, but where it's talking about some states and locales lowering the voting age to 16. Do you know if that's doable, or is the 18 a federal standard, or what can you share since we have
Sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting issue that keeps popping up and you know, every time you see generations of where young people are like stepping in and changing, you know, engaging in social activism, you have these questions because these came up like during the Vietnam War, and that was actually a big time. That's when we amended the United States Constitution during the Vietnam War, because at that time the federal law said 21 was when you could register to vote. And even though some states allowed 18-year-olds, but here we had all these people fighting in a war, and these young people were like, hey, if we can be drafted, we should be able to vote. And hence we passed the 26th Amendment. Federal law sets the floor for your voting rights, not the ceiling. And so states are always able to provide greater rights than federal law allows for. And so some states allow for pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, like when they go get a driver's license or something like that, and automatically put them in the queue, and then they become eligible once they turn 18. And in some rare instances, there have been calls for younger people to be able to cast a ballot. We saw this come up again after the Parkland high school shooting, where all those high school students were really leading this political charge to and really awoke the country to a lot of issues, and it raised again the specter of, well, maybe those folks should be able to vote. In Missouri, though, you have to be 17 and a half and be 18 by election day in order to be eligible to vote.
We have one here, and this goes back to the, if you're contacted that there's something wrong with your mail-in ballot and you have the right to come in and cure it. What happens if you're unable to travel? What options exist to you for that?
You know, this is a real concern. It's something that we saw happen to scores of voters in August. In fact, many volunteers with the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, the St. Louis Voter Protection Coalition, and the League of Women Voters actually assisted St. Louis County Board of Elections in trying to reach out to voters who had deficiencies in those ballots. And to St. Louis County Election Board's credit, they actually agreed to deputize these volunteers from the League of Women Voters to make these phone calls. It was about a week before the election, and they were absolutely overwhelmed with the onslaught of, so many ballots coming in and people coming in to vote by absentee in person. And unfortunately, the only way those folks could fix those deficiencies, even if it was just a checkbox saying yes, my address is the same, they could only come down and do it in person. And our volunteers have heartbreaking stories of people that were crying, and some of them were in long-term care facilities, and we're like, we're locked down, we're not allowed to leave the premises, or of other people that just simply didn't have the means or didn't think it was safe. And so this is a real issue that needs to be addressed. Missouri does not mandate a sort of notice and cure kind of process, and we believe that they should. And we also believe that ballots shouldn't be rejected for sort of non-material things. This checkbox things in St. Louis County is a real problem. And like in the August election, that checkbox was real tiny. And so in particular, many seniors didn't notice it. And the truth is, your address is on this ballot in like 2 or 3 other places. I mean, there's a lot of places where it is, and they check it against your address in the database. And so our data from the public records requests we sent shows that aside from ballots arriving too late, ballots that arrived after Election Day, deficiencies on that ballot envelope, failing to check a checkbox, failing to sign were the number one reason. Otherwise, valid ballots got rejected. And so we are hoping to change that. St. Louis County is looking at changing their envelope to help make it a little bit easier for folks. This is the reason, though, that the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition engages in the advocacy that we do. We meet with election officials and say, hey, take a look at these reports we got. These are the real life kinds of barriers that people are experiencing. And maybe you didn't realize that this was going to be confusing, or maybe you didn't realize by having a checkbox with only 8-point font that people, particularly seniors, might have difficulty reading that. And to their credit, they are looking at changing what that envelope looks like.
Okay. One that just came in here. If you have completed your absentee ballot but for some reason cannot find it, how you talked about these certifications or showing up at polling and affidavits. You want to just run through that one more time for the benefit of our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if you got that absentee ballot in the mail and you can't find it anymore, or if you never got it in the mail, you can just go and vote on Election Day at your polling place. And now you're going to be on a list. They're going to say, I see here you applied for an absentee ballot. And you're going to have to say, I lost it or I never got it. And you're going to have to fill out a statement, that a lost ballot affidavit, where you're going to attest to that. But doing that will then sort of effectively cancel out that absentee, because remember, you only got one parking spot. And right then your absentee was sort of provisionally there. And you say, I never got it, or I lost it, or I don't have it. We can cancel out your absentee ballot, and then your parking spot is opening. You can park your election day vote there. But you only get one parking spot.
And I can do that even on an early voting day, not just on election day?
No, well, so during the absentee voting period, only people who qualify to vote absentee can vote absentee at the election board headquarters. People, no excuse mail-in voters cannot, no.
Do you know what steps are being taken to protect voters from harassment or intimidation in this election?
You guys have great questions. Yeah, this is, it's barely September and it's already a very volatile election year. And the rhetoric is at fever pitch. And I think we can expect that to be more of the same going forward. There are laws on the books, both federal law and state law make intimidation of voters illegal. And that includes actually a prolonged police presence at the polling places, particularly in certain communities. Depending on where we live, we might find police presence at the polling place to be comforting, but certainly in some jurisdictions, think, Ferguson, for example, police presence at the polling place might not be so comforting. In fact, it might be very scary or intimidating. And so that's something we really track, and we meet with election officials ahead of time to check with them about this. This is another reason why we strongly urge people to call the 866-RVOTE hotline, because it's answered live. We're able to track incidents in real time. We meet not only with election officials ahead of election day, but also with the prosecuting attorney and the FBI and other law enforcement agencies that are charged with enforcing voter intimidation laws. And we take it very, very seriously. And we do reach out to election officials to document and request immediate action regarding any incidents of voter intimidation. And I'm going to add misinformation in here too, even though it's a little bit of a separate issue, because we've been seeing just so much information out there that half-truths, to outright lies, to just wrong information out there. And that's something that is really just a novel challenge in a way that it hasn't been in previous years. It's one reason we've added a new position to election protection, our social media monitors. And we're actually starting that well ahead of election day to really be able to ferret out and find misinformation online and stop it. And even in the media, we have actually had a fair amount of success responding to media outlets that have provided sort of not exactly accurate information and gotten them to correct it. And so it really just speaks to the importance of calling the 866-RVOTE hotline. And we can certainly use all the volunteers we can get to help identify and ferret out this misinformation, because we do follow up and we do reach out to the election officials. And by and large, they are extremely committed to stopping any such incidents.
We've had one more question sneak in under the wire here. If you confirm with the BOE via the online site that your ballot has been received, does it also mean that it has been determined to be valid?
Not necessarily. Yeah. So if it's received, it means it goes into the pile that's received. And starting that few days before election day, they can start really sort of assessing whether or not it's complete and is able to be counted. If that ballot envelope does not include your name, if it does not include your address confirmation, if you haven't signed it, if it hasn't been notarized, if it's required to be. Those are all reasons that that ballot could end up being rejected and not counted. Again, just the importance of really placing eyes on that ballot envelope to make sure that it's fully complete. You know, it's not something we think about because we think about the act of voting and filling out the ballot, you know, and then we just throw it in the envelope and stick it in the mail. Make sure that form is complete, because if it's not, it could result in your ballot not being counted. And again, we continue to work with election officials to identify ways to ensure that people get notice of those deficiencies, but it's not necessarily guaranteed that you will be notified if that's the case. And it could just be that your ballot won't be counted.
It's been a very informative evening. I want to thank our speakers for a very informative evening and taking their time to share this with us. I want to thank everybody out there in the audience who's joined us tonight. We've had some great questions. I know I've learned some things that are going to help me. Hopefully you've learned some things. But I think the number one takeaway, as we heard Kathy stress, and we're hearing a lot of people say, is have a plan how you're going to vote this year and pay attention to the details. It's going to be very important this year. So with that, we will wrap this up for this evening, and thank you again, our speakers and our guests, and please be safe out there. And we will see you again in a couple weeks at our next meeting. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.